Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canale, and welcome to Before the Lights podcast, the show to find out how those in sports, music, and entertainment made their mark. Today, we have a panel for you. That's right, a panel. This is Mob Talk, and you're going to hear clips from 13 previous podcasts and guests. That's right. We have compiled for you a fantastic show talking about the mob. On the show is Casey McBride, Larry McShane, Larry Mazza, Ori Spado, Gary Jenkins, Pamela Payton, Larry Henry, Geoff Schumacher, Geno Munari, Bob Delaney, Giovanni Rocco, and Jack Garcia. To start the show, Casey McBride, Frank Costello expert, talks about the attempted hit on Frank in 1957. Why was that hit put out?
There's a lot of theories about that. The most common one was just that Vito Genovese wanted to take over the family, and he needed to get, at that point, depending on who you talk to, a lot of people say, Frank was the boss, and so he was standing in the way. And, some of those guys, the easy solution is just get rid of the guy. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. I don't necessarily think that I don't think he considered himself to be the boss. I think he considered himself to be a caretaker for Lucky, who had been deported at that time. And he was sort of running things on his behalf. Vito Genovese had to leave the country pretty early on in that whole history to avoid a murder rap. But he ended up coming back to New York. And when he did, a lot of people, I think the common, story out there is, well, Frank was running things at that time because he was sort of the next in line. And then, and Vito wanted the job back. But I think in a lot of ways, Vito did get the job back when he came back. I think Frank, still considered him probably to be the head guy. The problem was that Frank, a lot of his rackets were really where the money was coming in from. Frank was really successful, first of all, in the Prohibition, like I said, and then when Prohibition ended, he went into slot machines and gambling, and he was a real pioneer in kind of the gaming industry here in the country at that time. So his businesses were bringing in a lot of money. And I don't, Vito, even if he was in charge, it really wasn't his rackets that were bringing in the cash. And whoever's bringing in the cash is the guy that people are going to go to, for, whatever. I think Vito he needed to get rid of Frank so he could feel like he really did have full control over everything. So he put a hit out on him, the Chin Gigante, which, supposedly followed Frank into his lobby at his apartment, said, "This is for you, Frank." And Frank turned around and he fired a shot. And luckily, because Frank was moving, the shot just grazed his head. It put a hole in his hat, but it didn't kill him. And the Chin thought he was dead and left, took off in a car, but Frank survived. And I mean, he got the message, so he retired. So the end result was the same. But there's a lot of controversy too, and stories around that where some people say he never meant to kill him. It was just supposed to be a warning. There's even some conspiracy theories out there that he wasn't the shooter. I don't subscribe to either of those. I mean, I just think that's too complicated, and I don't know anybody out there that could really make a shot where you could just graze somebody's head like that. Yeah. And Occam's razor, the simplest solution is usually the one, and I think he simply missed. So Frank, he was real lucky, and he was supposedly retired at that point, but he never really did. He was always still sought after for advice to help with problems. He was still a really important figure all the way up until the time he died in 1973. An old man. He was, in his early 80s at the time, and some of the folks I've talked to that had actually met him and knew him and were in that world one of the guys, he remembered meeting him just a few months before he passed away. And they were meeting him on they needed some help with a union problem that they had. So, I mean, people were still coming to him with issues and problems to solve all the way up until, the time that he died. And according to this guy that I talked to, they said, there was no moss growing under his shoes. He was sharp as a tack still. And I think he enjoyed people coming to him to solve problems like that. He got another nickname, Uncle Frank, which he really liked. Everybody, he's like the uncle that solved all your problems, kind of a thing. So he was an important guy, like I said, from pretty much from the get-go.
Larry McShane, New York crime author, a veteran reporter of the New York Daily News, and a two-time AP New York State Staffer of the Year. I want to jump to 1985. I understand you have a pretty good story about the night that Paul Castellano was murdered outside of Sparks Steakhouse.
Yeah, I'm working, I think, a noon to 8 shift. Our offices were in Rockefeller Center. And again, we're like going in the Wayback Machine. The police department used to send out, not really crime tips, but if there was something that they thought would be interesting to the media, homicides mostly, via fax machine. So we get a fax saying that 2 guys have been shot outside Spark Steakhouse at like maybe 5:30 at night. So, obviously it's an odd location. 2 guys are dead. And quickly we get word that it's Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino family. So they send me over and I run, the 5-6 blocks to get over there. And when I got there, the cops were already on the scene. But it was really bizarre because they had huge Klieg lights lighting up the whole street. And so it looked like a movie set, but it wasn't any movie set, and the 2 bodies were out in the street and the cops were all over the place. And at first nobody would confirm it, but then another reporter and I spotted Jim Fox, who was the head of the New York FBI at the time. And Jim said, yeah, that's him. So then I had to run to a payphone, no cell phones, and call the office and dump my notes. And I think more than anything, that one experience kind of professionally, at least, got me interested in the mob stuff. And it was a great time for it. The commission trial was coming up without Castellano as a defendant, obviously.
Yeah.
Chin Gigante was kind of rising in the Genovese family. There would be the Columbo family war upcoming, and there was just a lot of stuff. And the other thing that was interesting is, at the time, Rudy Giuliani was the U.S. attorney in Manhattan. He was prosecuting a lot of these cases, and, he really enjoyed the attention and the limelight. And so it's kind of a perfect storm for a reporter,
You're the one that broke the story for the AP.
Yeah, but I didn't do much except run,
You had an incident one time. I'm not sure where it was. I was doing some research on your background. Were you at a location or in a restroom and turn around and saw Gotti?
Yes. There was a pending indictment against John Gotti and his brother Gene in Brooklyn Federal Court across the river from Manhattan. And so I went out to cover a couple of days of it. It was a big story, obviously. At that point, Gotti had ascended to boss of the family. And so there's a break, and I went into the men's room down the hall from the courtroom. And the door opens, and I don't think anything of it. And I turn around, and there's John and Gene. And they don't say anything, but the look makes it clear that, I need to finish and get out of there quickly.
You weren't welcome there anymore.
Yeah, exactly. This was like their boardroom, I guess, for the duration of the trial. That was my brush with the Gotti brothers.
Listeners, you can get the complete podcast of all of these. Go to the show notes. There's going to be links to every single one of the full interview, so you can get more in depth on each one of these guests talking about their aspects with the mob. Let's hear from Larry Mazza, who's a former enforcer with the Columbo crime family and the author of The Life. At 27 years old, you were proposed to be a made man for your life. To be able to be proposed, you have to kill someone to be required to get your button. Was that part of the whole situation with you?
Of course, I was involved, and you don't have to actually pull the trigger. You have to be involved, whether you're a crash car, whether you're a backup shooter, whether you're the getaway driver. And I was all of those things, including dropping him off, knowing he was going to shoot a guy and coming around, So there was probably a dozen of those before the war started that I was around. And when Greg Jr. Went away for 20 years and Greg got sick, but he went to the family and requested strongly, and he was powerful enough that they should have done it immediately, that me, Jimmy, and another fellow named Joe would get straightened out, because he was going to need somebody with that badge, that street badge, to run his things if something happened to him while Junior was away, Greg Jr. But what happened when Junior Persico went away and Vic Arena took over, Vic started making only guys close to him, guys in Long Island, and he was pushing the Brooklyn guys aside. So that was, a lot of people don't realize that, but that was one of the early moves that started causing tension and causing a split. And, some bodies turning up that people don't realize were what led to the war. So, yeah, I was proposed at about 27 years old.
Can you speak regarding, so my listeners can understand, how somebody's gradually pulled in, of you getting an order just to go flatten someone's tire and then reading a headline the next day?
That's what I told you about baby steps. And that's a true story. And it's an ironic type of thing. He asked me to give a guy a flat. I don't ask any questions. I'm around long enough I'm not going to ask him why. I just, I said to myself, no big deal. And I'm thinking the guy parked in his spot, or, maybe cut him off or something silly, So I had to go early in the morning, like 6 o'clock. I give the guy the flat. The next day I read, man killed fixing flat. So I saw the car. It's the car I gave the flat to, the picture. Guy's laying there with a jack in his hand or whatever. And I go to the club, and I remember I knew better than to bring it up. And I think it was the earliest test. If I would have said, Greg, what happened? I mean, that guy got killed. Like, show any panic or worry or concern. I just didn't say boo. And, again, in hindsight, it was probably a test to see if the next step could be taken when he asked me to buy a shovel and then to go with his son and dig a hole. And then, just gradually, then dump a body in the hole. And then, it's just that step. Then you're sitting next to him and you watch him shoot somebody, like I did once. And then ultimately he sits next to you and watches you shoot somebody. It's a slow, gradual thing. And the other, farce, not that it never happens, but your first hit is rarely a friend or somebody you know. It's generally somebody that it's just business. You don't have a personal relationship. If they would have told me ever to kill my best friend, Jimmy, that was my partner since we're kids, they're not going to ask me to do it. They better not, because it's not happening, And I think that, that happens to a lot of us, at a younger age, where you're not going to be asked to kill the friend.
It said that you were involved in around 20 murders. You talked about maybe the first time of somebody you don't know. There was a situation where Greg's daughter was attacked, almost raped at a young age. You were asked to give that guy a beating and then eventually go back and take him out.
Right. Well, little Linda, who had become like a sister to me. I was at a Sweet 16. I was godfather to her brother, little Joey. Calls the club one day, actually called her mother, and the mother called us, that the car service driver that usually takes her to school deviated from his course and took her to a park and tried seducing her and tried to get her, to do something. And she was enough to get out of it. and get home and tell her mother. The mother called Greg at the club. I was sitting down playing cards. He came right over to the table. He says, Larry, come on, we got to take a ride. I got up. He took my cousin Joe and another fella, Sal, and Carmine Sessa. About 5 of us went, and we go to the car service. He's not there. We talk to the owner. At first, he's reluctant to give up any information. After Greg told him a few things, he gave us the address. So we go to the guy's house. He comes out, and we take him for a walk about 2 blocks to a park, and we just beat him probably for 15 minutes. Just kept pounding him, broke almost every bone in his body. We heard a few more blows to the head. He would have been dead. So it took him about 6 weeks to get back home, and then several weeks more to get back to work. And in that time, Greg decided, probably with a little coaxing from Big Linda, who never got over it, that he needed to kill this guy. So a plan was formed that we would keep calling the car service, and eventually it would be him one day. Finally, after weeks of doing that, the guy pulls up, and I was one of the guys that knew him, so that's basically why I was on it, because I could point them out and make sure we get the right guy. And it's funny, neither Gregory or I was supposed to be on it. Captain Scappy said it's personal. You're making it too personal. They can't be on it. So we asked him, but Greg knew that, how we felt. So anyway, we got him that day. He came to the address, got in the car, and he seen it coming. So the first gunshot, he picked his arm up and hit him on the side. So he got out of the car, and he started running. Greg Jr. chased him down, and he finished him right in the middle of the street on 13th Avenue in front of a bus. The bus had to stop where the guy fell. Probably dozens of people watching. Today, they would have had their cameras out on their phone.
Right.
But back then, there were no cell phones. So after it was done, Greg asked me to go back. So I put a baseball hat on, my sunglasses. I just went back. And, the typical Brooklyn answer, nobody knows nothing. So there was no witnesses. Nobody saw anything. And he was gone.
Former insurance salesman to Hollywood fixer and author of The Accidental Gangster. Let's hear from Ori Spado. Do you think you got too big too fast?
I always had a saying in legitimate business, the two worst things in business is no growth and fast growth. I've always had a tendency for fast growth. Even in my legitimate businesses, when I would put sales forces together, I'm excellent at motivating people, getting them to go out to make the sales. I only hire people strictly on a commission basis. Somebody asks me for a salary, I show them to the door, okay? Because they're not looking to work. I would always have fast growth. And I grew too quick. One company I had called American Check Guarantee, I grew so rapidly. And before you knew it, I had the whole floor over here on Wilshire and Santa Monica Boulevard. And then computers. I didn't know nothing about computers, but I needed them. I bought them. I had like 17 of them. I had people working, one guy in charge of them. And then that guy don't come to work one day and nobody can turn their computers on. So what do I got to do? I got to send 2 guys to that guy's house. They literally picked him up in the chair he was sitting in and brought him to the office.
Chair and all, we're going.
Then and I made him give the information to other people how to turn the system on. And then he had the audacity to go to the labor board and try to get money from me. And I remember it was over on Sunset and Coanga. So I brought a friend of mine that day, and I walked in, we were scheduled for like 2:00. And I walk in, he's sitting down. His name was Anthony, I won't forget it. I said, Anthony, how are you, my friend? Oh, Lori, I'm good. Hi. Anthony, I want you to say hello to Dominic. And then I walk out. I'm standing outside in front of the building. And a few minutes later, you see Anthony running out, getting in his car.
Dominic had something to help with.
Yeah.
Gary Jenkins, a former Kansas City Police Intelligent Unit detective and podcast host of Gangland Wire, which I highly recommend you check out and subscribe to, speaks about dealing with Tuffy DeLuna and getting the notes, what was really going on with the Las Vegas skim. Gary, how did you end up obtaining the ledger notes that were kept by Tuffy DeLuna, and how good were these notes? Were they pretty spot on?
They were pretty good. You know, we did this for months and months, and finally the Bureau said, we got to take this down. The case agent, Bill Owsley, the U.S. attorney, David Helfrey, both are, and the supervisor down there, Gary Hart, they were really bright guys. They were, they'd have made good street policemen. And I don't often say that about an FBI agent. They'd have made a good policeman. They said, okay, it's time. We got to take this down. We've gathered enough. And they served on, 50 years after the first St. Valentine's Day massacre to the day, we served search warrants on all our mob bosses in Kansas City, the guys who were involved with the skim that we picked up on the wire. And they did the same thing in Chicago and Cleveland and Milwaukee in exactly the same time. And we took off, we were able to take off our courier from the Tropicana that night. He was coming back with 2 packages of money. And Bill Owsley says, he said, I'm wondering where he hid that money. Did he have like a secret compartment? And I told him to empty his pockets, and he took $40,000 out of one coat pocket. He took $40,000 out of the other coat pocket and laid it down on the desk in front of me. And so we went into I went into Tuffy DeLuna's house with a team of agents and started searching. And I'll never forget. Shea Airy was kind of the lead agent in charge there, and he was an old-time FBI agent, been here for 20 years. He knew Tuffy well, and Tuffy knew him well. And finally, Tuffy said, Shea said, you might as well go down the basement. That's where the good stuff is. And they just hadn't got to the basement yet. And Tuffy had an office down there, and he had a desk. So they start going through the desk drawers, and they start pulling out these little notebook. It has these notations on it, and they don't really know nobody knows what they got at the time. You do see list of names with like a percentage next to it. So we got, kind of who the made guys were and who got what percentage. And they had like at the bottom of that had Rancher 1500. As it turned out, when that was deciphered, that was the head of the Teamsters in Kansas City, Roy Lee Williams. And he was known by code name by them as the Rancher. And it was $1,500 a month. And all these other names that we knew who they were kind of their usual street names. And they got a certain percentage of the skim. Even though maybe Felix, he didn't have anything to do with it, but he was getting 5% every month, which is a pretty nice deal for a mob boss to have that much money to keep 10 or 15 people just steady, $200 every month for just being there.
Yeah.
And his brother and his underboss got even more. I can't remember exact percentages, and that's at $40,000. So, 10% would be $4,000 every month, which wouldn't be bad. And I think they got like Nick probably seemed like he was taking 20, and so that would be $8,000 every month cash money. That you weren't doing anything, you didn't have to spend anything. You just walked up and handed it to you. So as they deciphered those notes, so they got them back to the office and started deciphering those notes. Tuffy had kept these specific notations for specific things that he did. Like he went to Las Vegas on a certain date, and he had how much the airplane ticket was out, how much he paid for parking, how much back. He made notations about using code names about what he did out there. Went to see the Brain and talked to him and had some other little codes that matched up with, they could put him in Las Vegas at that time. And then Alan Glick could say, yeah, he came out there on that date, and yeah, he told me I had to sell the casino, or what he said, you may find your life expendable, but I don't think you'll find the lives of your family expendable, and then named off his wife and his kids. And so then Alan Glick started trying to sell the Stardust and these other casinos out And of course, it had to be somebody that the four mob families approved of. So it was a little bit of a hard sell, and they had a hard time getting anybody through the gaming commission vetting process at that time. So, but those notes, they really used those extensively in the trial because they could match them up with wiretap information, with witness testimony, with public records, and really make sense out of them.
Next up on the panel, Pamela Payton, a four-time Miss Nevada and the co-host of the Frank Lefty Rosenthal show. She was also a former Vegas showgirl, enlightens us about her relationships with Frank and Jerry Rosenthal, along with meeting Tony Spilotro. What was Frank Rosenthal like to you?
Very gentlemanly. He was always very polished, very immaculate in his appearance, very reserved, almost stoic.
And what was his wife, Jerry, like? How much interaction did you ever have with her?
Well, one time he had a party at his place in the country club, and I was really expecting a huge mansion, but it was kind of a townhome that was separate and very nice. It was amazing amount of security inside, outside. We could see the various cameras, and that was new to me because this was, in the late 70s. The place was very kind of contemporary, modern, very neatly decorated, and we could see pictures of the two children, and just very down to earth, very nice. Matter of fact, I had a party in my own home. I had a tri-level, and Frank was just so down to earth. He came to it. So here's the show, people, and I got valet parking much to my neighbor's chagrin, to help park the cars. And it was a potluck, and Frank Rosenthal came to my little house party.
And for those people that may not know much about Frank Rosenthal, or perhaps not seen the movie Casino, he operated 4 casinos. He was married to Jerry Rosenthal. She unfortunately died at 46 of a drug overdose. Pam, have you ever hear anything? I know you've been gone out of it for a while, but have you heard anything that Jerry and Frank may have been informants for the FBI?
Well, I read a lot in general, and I've certainly read a lot regarding Casino. I was reading Casino, the book by Nicholas Pileggi, at 1 a.m. in the morning, and I turn a page, and here's the dialogue between Frank and myself about, I think, 3 pages that was highlighted in this book, and I realized, oh my goodness, this Pam Payton is me. He's writing about me in the book. I never even knew. Nobody said anything. So yes, I've heard different rumors and things. I don't know exactly. There was just only certain things presented to me, and I do know that as time was progressing, he was being called back to Chicago a lot, and he was getting into more heat because he was bringing too much attention to himself and trying to become licensed. And the mob does not want that.
No, they did not.
Frank was somewhat transparent, and he could be somewhat revealing as to the things that were irritating him. So during the show, for instance, Jerry came over to him, and she was clearly had drank too much, and Frank was being somewhat constrained in not. I could see that he was trying to exercise a lot of, tact in knowing how to answer some of the things, her insecurities that she was bringing to him while being in during the show.
What were your thoughts? And I'm not sure if you were in Vegas or you were in Beverly Hills or in LA when you heard that Frank Rosenthal's car had been bombed in 1982.
Oh my goodness. It was such a shock. Those are places we always go to eat, Tony Roma's and the fact that he lived through that, when you see the pictures of the car and just the design of the car and the fluke of the matter that he should have survived that. And, so all of that was depicted in the movie Casino very accurately, I felt. There's so much about that that was right on the mark. By the way, when I was in the Rosenthal show, I met Tony the Ant Spilotro, and sitting down, he was just maybe a little bit taller than myself. So he's a very, very short guy, but very immaculately dressed, very charming, and never would have thought him to be. Many of Rosenthal's entourage. Many of them were Italians. Rosenthal himself was not Italian. He was Jewish. He didn't look anything like Robert De Niro. I think Jerry could say that Sharon Stone looked a lot like Jerry. She was definitely very beautiful. But you see these people around them, they just seem like everyday people. You never think that they do these other things.
So you didn't think that from your interactions with Tony Spilotro that he was a mob killer or a hitman?
Not at all. It's so amazing. Don't be thinking that the world is all nice people. You've got to be careful. They can look really nice, but then they do these bad things on the side.
From one perspective of Frank and Jerry Rosenthal to a complete different perspective that came in Thanksgiving of 2020 on a Patreon Zoom call with my guests, which you can get by joining the members area. Go to beforethelightspod.com/support for that. We had special guest star Larry Henry on, and he talked about the really tough life of Jerry Rosenthal.
She grew up in Van Nuys, California, made her way to Las Vegas. She was kind of the wild child of the family. It was a pretty stable family, and made her way to Las Vegas. And back then, Las Vegas, then it was kind of a grind joint town. Speaking of Chicago, the Chicago mob was really big in Las Vegas. Johnny Roselli came down from L.A., from Chicago to L.A. over to Las Vegas. Then Tony Spilotro came in representing Chicago. Then Lefty Rosenthal took over Argent Corp, 4 casinos for the Chicago outfit. He wasn't in the outfit. He was Jewish, couldn't be a made man because he wasn't of Italian descent, Sicilian descent. But he ran the 4 casinos in Las Vegas that Argent owned. The Hacienda, where Mandalay Bay is, Stardust, where Resorts World is going up, Fremont, which is still there, by the way, in downtown Las Vegas, and Marina, which is now part of the MGM Grand. But, she was a chip hustler. She would go, to casinos and hustle gamblers at craps tables and 21 tables. She was a prostitute. She was a topless dancer at the Trop. Lefty lived at the Trop for a while. It was always a heavily controlled mob casino. It was, even back, it opened in 1957. It was sort of the jewel of the Strip. The southern end of the Strip where the Trop is, out by the airport, was way out back then. Rosenthal lived at the Trop, met Jerry, said, Nick Pileggi, who wrote the book Casino, quotes Rosenthal saying she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Back then, again, Las Vegas was different. These shows, you had these big, I know you guys know this, but, they had these big extravagant shows with the feathers and the show, the topless stuff and all that stuff. It was just a lot different back then. And she was one of those. And so they had a very tumultuous romance. He was abusive, violent. He was a mob guy. He was a bookie. And she was, they both heavily drank. They lived at the country club. They were not seen as Sharon Stone and Robert De Niro. They were seen as kind of, just criminals and kind of slimeballs, really, and they weren't these big stars that they're thought of now. And then so they, they lived at the country club, and they went to the country club and they dined and hung out with the elite of Las Vegas. He was so abusive. He was so abusive. Frank Lefty Rosenthal beat her constantly, violently. They were both heavy drinkers and drug users and angry drunks, and so they would fight constantly. There's a famous a piece in Pileggi's book where on the driveway of their home at the country club, which the Mob Museum has had, people live there now, know its history. They had a big fight. She came out with a gun one time. I think they actually did portray this in the movie. She came out with a gun one time. Nancy Spilotro, Tony Spilotro, the aunt, was the mob overseer in Las Vegas for the Chicago mob. Nancy, his wife, Nancy comes over. Jerry's in the parking lot. The driveway with a gun, had just been freshly beaten up. And so it was that sort of relationship. So she goes to a bank. It's still there on the Strip near Circus. She goes to a bank, withdraws a bunch of jewels and things in a safety deposit box, millions of dollars worth, which back, we're talking early 80s, late 70s, millions of dollars in jewels now is an enormous amount. But back then it was, a fortune. So she takes that, goes to California. She gets mixed up, just a real rough life. She was when she was killed or died. She goes to LA, gets mixed up with a bunch of bikers, the sort of the California biker crew. And they abused her also and realized she was wealthy. They knew who Lefty was. Everybody knew who Lefty was. Everybody was afraid of Lefty, by the way. He had an enormously volatile temper, which he took out on her, but on a lot of other people too. So the bikers didn't really want anything to do with Lefty, but they wanted his money. And so she got hooked up with these bikers and got heavily into drugs. Wanders down Hollywood Boulevard, Sunset, actually, one night and stumbles in 4 a.m. Sunset Boulevard Hotel where junkies and, ne'er-do-wells were sort of hanging out and collapses in the lot, bruised head to toe, apparently from just batterings, people beating her up all the time, and needle bruises because she was a, needle user. Just a super, super tough life, Tommy. And, you and I have talked about this. And, to me, when you look at the whole Las Vegas in the 70s, Tony Spilotro, Lefty Rosenthal, to me, the most fascinating character of that whole group is Jerry Rosenthal.
I had the pleasure to speak with Geoff Schumacher, who is the Vice President of Exhibits and Program of the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. How similar was Joe Pesci actually to Tony the Ant Spilotro?
That question also came up recently in our conversations with Oscar Goodman and with Nick Pileggi. And what's interesting is Oscar has 2 takes on that. The first take was he tells a story about going to the set of Casino. Remember, Oscar had a couple of small scenes in the movie. And as he's in a room and he's looking across the room at the back of an individual at the other side of the room. And he has a sort of like a deja vu moment, like, oh my God, that's Tony Spilotro standing over there, my old client. Well, in fact, it wasn't Tony Spilotro, it was Joe Pesci. And Oscar was just amazed. Joe's a relatively diminutive individual, as was Tony Spilotro, about low 5 feet area. And he also held his arm the way Tony Spilotro would often have one arm crooked open out, from his side. And so I think visually, Joe Pesci did a really good job of depicting Tony Spilotro. Now, what Oscar had a problem with, though, was the language that he heard, in the dialogue. In other words, Joe Pesci in the movie, the F word was basically every other word that he uttered in the movie. I think somebody said, somebody counted the expletives in the movie, and it was well in excess of 400. So I think most of those were said by Pesci. According to Oscar, at least in his experience with Tony Spilotro, he said he was a relatively mild-mannered, very courteous, especially around women and children, that Oscar said he never heard him use that word one time in his presence. Now, that's not to say he didn't use it elsewhere, but at least in a good chunk of his life, he was not that person. And so Oscar took some issue with that. But by all accounts, Pesci worked really hard to try to be the Tony Spilotro that you see in video clips and in books, and he seemed to do a good job.
The one thing that stood out to me in the movie is, Tony Spilotro is blacklisted from going into casinos, when in actuality, in real life, I don't believe he was, but Lefty Rosenthal was.
Right. Lefty was in the Black Book, as I recall, and there was big fights about that. Oscar spent his career trying to keep people out of the Black Book. He believed it was an unconstitutional act on the part of the state gaming control regulators. He lost that battle, obviously. But what Oscar objected to so strenuously was this notion that you don't have the freedom to go, even if you live in Nevada, you can't enter a casino. That means you also can't go to the restaurants there. You can't go to the restrooms there. You can't go to the movie theaters. You can't go to the bowling alleys, nothing. And he always thought that was a little much. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it was Lefty who had the biggest issue there.
Geno Munari, the author of the book, Las Vegas Dunes Hotel, The Mob, The Connections, and the Stories. It was said that the Dunes had a super secret room for bookmaking. Was this true? And if so, where was it?
Well, I never was in the room, but they had I believe they had a place that they used to answer phone calls, and
who was involved in it?
Well, it's all documented. You had Wyman, you had Gordon. They indicted Maurice Dodson. I think it was Phil, a guy by the name of Vera, who was a lines maker, and he was just a great lines maker. He wasn't really an operator of the book, and they operated the book. But I think of something that they had for years and years and years. In one weekend, the FBI discovered that they won $320,000 on one day therein. So it was a pretty successful operation. But I believe there was informants. I don't think the FBI figured it out. They either used surveillance of bug lines, or somebody actually came in and talked to them about it.
Do you know where the room was in the Dunes?
It was one of the hotel rooms, I assume.
Okay.
It could have been off. It could have been off the second floor, third floor. I've never been to the room, and all they did was basically have a guy that would take bets.
Gotcha.
And they used the long distance telephone probably to watch lines to do that with.
Hoffa was mentioned over the Dunes and alleging Frank Fitzsimmons was skimming. In your opinion, do you believe that this had some of the downfall to Jimmy Hoffa?
Let's put it this way. Hoffa's hand-picked guy was Dorfman to handle the loans, right?
Alan Dorfman.
That was his hand-picked guy. And he basically threatened Shanker. And they felt that they had something coming that Hoffa didn't pay them. And they had the money coming, and they tried to put it on Shanker. So it looks like there was some very, very interesting issues of Hoffa's loyalty to Shanker and so forth. And by the way, you'll see that Shanker was quoted when he's talking about how the Stardust was basically pulled from under him. He was trying to buy the Stardust with the Teamsters. And Durlacher went to the guy that owned it, that owned the Recreon, and basically pulled the wool from under Shanker, the rug from under Shanker. And Shanker, you'll never hear Todd Durlacher's name paged in the Dunes Hotel. So that was Wyman's very close associate. So there's lots of going on there. That, but I do believe Hoffa had a piece of the Dunes, no question about it.
I really owe a lot to this next guest, Larry Henry, the veteran print and broadcast journalist. We did stories on the mob. Larry was the very first guest on Before the Lights to really talk about the mob. I highly recommend that you join his two Facebook groups. One is Mob Summit. The other one is a Las Vegas Mafia history page. Once again, go to the show notes to get links to the full interviews of all these guests. Ned Day. Ned was an investigative reporter with the Las Vegas Review-Journal and News Channel 8 TV. In 1987, he had a series called Mob on the Run. In 1986, his car gets firebombed. And then in 87, he's on vacation in Hawaii and has a heart attack while scuba diving. And many people feel like that today, that was a mob hit. What do you know about the Ned Day situation, or did you know Ned?
I did. I knew Ned. I wasn't good friends with him. I mean, I knew him at that time, working for the governor and when I was at the newspaper up in Reno. What happened was extremely colorful person himself. He, from Milwaukee, his dad was a big-time bowler on the cover of national magazines, also named Ned Day. Got involved in some illegal activity. He had fallen on some, the dad had fallen on some hard times because of, some drinking and gambling. And one of his pro shops in Milwaukee became sort of an illegal bookmaking operation. He was under investigation, just had a tough time toward the end. Ned got involved with one of the mob bosses up, a big mob boss in Milwaukee, Frank Balistreri, the Mad Bomber, they called him. Ned worked in some of his strip joints and some of his bars. Ned was kind of a runner and bartender and married Miss Nude International. Then he later married a stripper who was murdered by one of her Johns while Ned was married to her in Milwaukee. Very colorful life, kind of a, dark side of Milwaukee. Runs into a journalism professor at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, who gets him interested in journalism and gets him interested in writing. So it sort of saved him. He's always been a scrappy guy, moves at the age of 31 to Las Vegas, knew from Milwaukee some of those underworld figures, like the best reporters, Nick Pileggi, Ned Day. They have sources on both sides of the law. They've got law enforcement sources, like all great reporters, people on all sides of the law. Well, Ned did that. He came to Las Vegas, had sources who were underworld guys and gals, and also had law enforcement sources. Went to work for the Valley Times, which was a really scrappy paper up in North Las Vegas. Got involved in some issues with Lefty Rosenthal and, but began to really shine a light. Ned Day comes into town, gets a column, and just really began to pound on the mob. Pounded on Tony Spilatro, called him, I think, some derogatory name. I don't want to repeat it. But so Ned Day goes after the mob, does this series, Mob on the Run, which to this day, I think is one of the best things that's been done about the mob in Las Vegas. To this day, it's really relevant. And Ned comes out in the beginning of this video, right there on the corner where now the Bellagio would be, where the Dunes was. He's shooting over his shoulder. You can see the flamingo and what was in the Barbary Coast. And so Ned came to Las Vegas and just did some real hard-hitting mob stuff. As a result, his car gets firebombed. He had, I think, some golf clubs in the back. He wasn't in the car at the time. Sent the signal that era in Las Vegas with the car bombings and the shootings. It was just a rougher period of time. An attorney, that former FBI guy, his car was blown up downtown. You had Benny Binion in the middle of that. So allegedly, by the way, Ned Day's car gets blown up. So because he was so aggressive in reporting on the mob, there was suspicion. He goes to Hawaii for vacation. I had filed a column from there. Now, George Knapp, great reporter, investigative reporter, still at Channel 8. George knows a lot. George was really good friends with Ned Day. There's a lot of stuff on the Channel 8 site, stories that George has done about Ned. Ned goes to Hawaii. Yeah, and in a scuba swimming incident, died. And so anytime, especially in that era, suspicion arises about a tough reporter investigating the mob, only a decade before that, down in Phoenix, a reporter's car got blown up and he was killed, and looking into some organized crime stuff. So anytime that happens, you wonder whether the mob was involved. To this day, I got direct message on Facebook not that long ago from a very respected, longtime reporter in Las Vegas. Can't say who, obviously, but who was telling me some things that may have led this reporter to believe there may have been some skullduggery involved. So even to this day, there's some suspicion. Now, the autopsy report labels it an accidental death. So there was no suspicion officially.
We're now going to shift gears and hear from three individuals that went undercover and dealt directly with the mob and took some of their members down. Up first is Bob Delaney, who is a former NBA referee and undercover New Jersey State Trooper, the author of Covert, which I highly recommend you get that book. And he's the executive for Delaney Consultants. Were you in constant fear being in undercover then?
Yes. Yeah. I lived in constant fear. And it was, if I was not wearing an on-body recorder, which was like a Niagara back then, we thought we were like 007 and compared to what they have today, it was a small reel-to-reel recorder, because if you recall and you see old-time movies, it used to be like a van sitting outside and you would have a transmitter on as an undercover. Well, if I kept showing up and that van keeps showing up, they're going to put 2 + 2 together.
Sure.
So, and also they had become more sophisticated with equipment that could read whether or not that transmissions were coming from your body. So we went to the reel-to-reel, and I would wear it in a cup, in a jock where you would normally put the cup. And then I had on-off switches into my pockets and microphones up under my armpits. And I usually would wear a vest or some kind of additional kind of clothing with a sport jacket in order to be able to help hide that. But we did over 300 recordings that way, but we also had our trucking company wired. And I'll just give you this one thing for how sophisticated it was for the 70s and how talented the electronic surveillance people were of the New Jersey State Police and the FBI. They came into the trucking company, tore the walls down one night, put all the equipment up, and in each corner of the office, they ajarred the molding so that there was a camera eye. There were no cell phones back then. So I could go to a phone booth, a telephone booth, dial a number, and then it would come on and say, the number you have called is a non-working number. Please hang up and call again. I would wait 20 seconds and put in a code. That would activate the equipment. Didn't have to have it on me. And then they had a briefcase that I carried that they wired. So it took the equipment off me, because the more I became ingratiated and became part of them, the concern was if they found this wire in that world, informants die. If I would have been found with the wire on, you're going to get whacked. I mean, it's just the way of the life.
Speaking of that, was there an instance or a number of times where you thought they found out who I am and my cover's blown and this could be it?
Yeah, early on, you've said this to other cops and have heard the same thing. At first, you think you've got cop written on your forehead. You think everybody knows what you're doing, and you're paranoid that you're not getting anywhere. And then you get to the point that you become comfortable, and that's the scary part, because when you become too comfortable, and the way I relate it to sports, Tommy, you know how you feel when you're in that locker room. There's not a player or referee that can't wait to get out of a locker room because you start to feel that juice running through your body. As it gets closer and closer to game time, and you want to get out and go. It's the same thing in working undercover. You want to go. It's like, but when you lose that juice or you lose that kind of nervous edge, you're not as sharp. And there were times I was losing that nervous edge. And I was becoming more comfortable with the bad guys than I was with the good guys. And that's the dangerous part.
What's the stress of that job, Bob, being undercover then for 3 years?
I do a lot of work with the military today in helping them understand the emotions and the psychological, emotional, and mind health and the physical responses that we have to stressors. Easiest way to explain it is probably like being on deployment. You know, if you're deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, you know you're going for a period of time. But then when there's multiple deployments, I had multiple deployments back to back to back because it was close to 3 years of my life that I became another person. You lose, and there's kind of an identity that takes place with what's going on now. I really didn't have social connections other than with the people I was working undercover with because my family connections were gone. And so my friend connections were gone. And we all know how we feel now. We yearn for that time to be able to hang out with our friends or our family members. And yet we can't do it because of COVID. I couldn't do it because of the undercover work. And so that isolation, and while I was going to big time dinners and I was hanging out and you know, I put on like 40 pounds when I was undercover, you know, the lifestyle, it's different when you're doing all those kinds of things with people you don't want to be around. And that's the kind of stressor that goes on. Plus the fact that in the back of your mind, you know that they're capable of putting a bullet in your head.
Retired FBI task force officer Giovanni Rocco has a lighter side spin on a conversation he had. Is the RICO story. If you don't know what RICO is, it's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act, and you can go Google it. Talk about the time that you were, I think, at dinner and they were talking about RICO, and you were like, "Who is this guy?"
Tommy, that was one of the best tapes I've ever made in my entire career. You could not have planned it any better. And by then, I'm going to pat myself on the back a little bit. I controlled the whole thing. And by then, I was almost the conductor of an orchestra, because by then I had all the skills to be a good undercover. I had the nerve to do it. I was in control of everything. So it was like I was the one picking what people would say at that point. And by this point in my career, I could tell you where to sit without you even knowing that I told you to sit there. I mean, the mind games that went on. So one night, I took them all out to dinner, and we were talking about earning some money and kicking up to Charlie and how we were going to do things. And, it was later in the case. So I was not a made guy, but I was doing the work of a soldier because I was reporting for Charlie. And he used me as a buffer. So we're sitting there eating dinner, and everybody's talking, and I'm letting them have their conversations, and they chatting away, and I'm recording everything with my devices. And I start hearing about this RICO, and I know they're talking about the federal law, RICO. Mm-hmm. And I hear RICO, and I'm sitting there, and I'm starting to get agita, and I'm starting to change my body language, and I'm starting to get a little annoyed, and finally I just slam my hands down the table, and I kind of, not for nothing, what's with this effing guy RICO? Like who is this guy RICO? And they all like, stop. I said, I don't like what I'm hearing here. Everybody's talking about RICO this, RICO that. It's one guy you're talking about. Who's afraid of some Spanish guy named RICO? And why are you all cowards? I got cowards in my crew here. What's going on? And they all just panicked. And they all looked at me with like deer in headlights. Finally, it was Charlie's son. And he says, no, Cougine. No. And he laughs at me. He goes, no, listen, cuz RICO's not a guy. RICO's a thing. RICO's a charge. What are you talking about? He goes, no, it's like a federal charge, racketeering. And he breaks it all down. So him and another guy in my crew, they start now tag teaming, breaking down what RICO is. No, it's a federal charge. And the one guy, older guy, he goes, no, what? And this guy, Mickey, he goes, what they do is what we're doing. Like me with the drugs and the trucking and this guy with the swag and this guy with this, everything we're doing and making money for you. And then you're kicking up to Charlie and it's going up the ladder. That's a RICO. That's a charge. What? What is this? When did this come about? And they explained to me, it's been around forever. And this is what I'm talking about. The government's going to pin all of us down. They can put all of us in jail just for sitting here talking about stuff. I said, wow, really? That's something. All right. So you know what? You all got to be careful from now on. I said, we can't bother. You got to look out for that. And I look at Anthony. I go, we got to look out for Daddy. This can really put Daddy in jail. And he says, yeah, Daddy can go to jail for this all the way out in Nevada. They'll go get him. I said, all right, no more of this. You guys got to be really careful in the street. From now on, I want to know everything you guys are doing. And that was it. So I made a beautiful tape. I always wished it went to trial so I could play that tape.
We close out this show by hearing a great clip from Joaquin Jack Garcia, who's a Cuban-American undercover FBI agent that took down a mafia family. Throughout the entire investigation, it eventually evolves to the point to where he proposes you to get your butt in or to become a made man. And then the case did get shut down before that happened. Hypothetically, Jack, what would that have done for the FBI had they allowed you to go through and actually become a made man in the Gambino family?
Tommy, this is one of the things that really have bothered me. And not just me, the former assistant United States attorney who prosecuted the case, some of the case agents involved in the case. And we thought that the FBI was very short-sighted in ending this case, okay? Because, and I said this to them, and it's in my book, and I showed my displeasure in my book. I felt that if I was going to go through and getting myself straightened out, that was going to open up what that world looks like, okay? And by that I mean, in the mob, there is a thing. I'll give you an example. Let's say, Tommy, you and me, and a guy will say Joey Bag of Donuts, okay?
Okay.
Now, Joey Bag of Donuts, you know, and I know, belong, let's say, to the Lucchese crime family, right? I can't go to Joey Bag of Donuts and say, hey, I'm Jack Falcone from the Gambinos. How you doing, brother? How's everything? Okay, it doesn't work that way. You need a third person who knows both of us, knows Joey Bag of Donuts and Jack Falcone, and make an introduction. That would be you. You come up and you say to both him and I, this is Joey. I said, I want you to meet Jack Falcone. He's a friend of ours. That tells everybody that I'm a made man, that you could talk freely about the inner workings of organized crime. And by inner workings, I'm talking about who are the family captains, who are the bosses, what companies, where are you shaking who down, where are you getting the money from, where's your loan shark? That's what that means. But if I said to you, if you came up to me and said, because I may need to talk to somebody in another family and said, hey, Joey, I want you to meet Jack. He's a friend of mine. That tells Joey that I'm not straightened out, that I'm just a friend of yours. I'm a guy who could be an associate. I'm a guy who's somehow connected. But in other words, don't tell this guy the secrets of what's happening in our world. So I wanted to be a friend of ours because I wanted to get everything, find out what companies are on record, what construction companies, who's being shaken down, where is their money coming from, the dirty local unions, who are the dirty cops and politicians. I wanted to be part of that. And not only that, I wanted to be able to bring some of these great undercovers that I have worked with over the years as come in as part of guys. Like, for instance, let's say we got somebody, a family in Philadelphia. And I had a guy in Philadelphia. Okay, and I say, hey, Greg, we create something. I got a situation with a guy in Philly. He's having a little bit. He says, you know anybody? Yeah, I'll get somebody. And then all of a sudden, now we have a meeting with the Philadelphia family. Boom. I put that guy in there. He's now doing what he has to do. Then I may have something in Scranton, or I may have something in Kansas City. All of this is what we would allow. So as opposed to getting the 9, okay, think of what those would be. And think of the damage that you could do. You listen, this was done once before by Donnie Brasco.
Right.
That was in 1981. And he had 6 years to do this. Fast forward to me, 2005, and I'm 2.5 years. So all I said is, give me the same time you gave Joe. You know, I'm right there at the cusp. I would have been straightened out had it not been for Joe Messina, who cooperated, and they knew that, so everything froze. So you wait another couple of months, 6 months or whatever. Let's keep going with that. I have been taught by the greatest case agents in the FBI and some good undercovers that when you work, you climb that ladder. You keep going up, up, up until you got no more to go. This, I felt, we were in about the third rung. It really was very. And like I said, I told about how wrong of a decision it was, how short-sighted it was. Yes, we did take down the administration. We took down the acting boss, the underboss. We took down numerous captains, not only with the Gambino crime family. We took down some Genovese captains as well as Lucchese. We did that, but we could have done so more. We're not in this for the glory. We're in this because we want to put the bad guys in jail. And that's what we felt we did.
I want to thank that entire panel for making this podcast actually happen. I personally think this was a great show, giving you great insight from 13 different people that have been on this show to talk about the mob. Definitely going to continue to bring on guests to talk about the mob and the mafia in the future. Thank you to all of them for doing that. Make sure that you follow the podcast. I need you to do me a great big favor, people. Take 30 seconds out of your day, wherever you're following the podcast. Please rate it 5 stars. Give me nice comments. It helps me grow the show immensely. Also, for Extra 5, and get on the Zoom calls, people. They are a ton of fun. Go to beforethelightspod.com/support to sign up and follow me on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everyone, a salute, a chin chin.